Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome back onto the show former paramedic, journalist, and author Kevin Hazzard. Now, if you didn't hear my first conversation with Kevin, it was episode 742, and we took a deep dive into his first two books, 1,000 Naked Strangers and then American Sirens, about the founding paramedics in Pittsburgh. In the second conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from revisiting the men from the Freedom House, the success of television dramas like The Pit, reflecting on the pandemic, his new book, No One's Coming, on the Ebola crisis, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I welcome back onto the show, Kevin Hazzard. Enjoy. Well, Kevin, I want to start by saying thank you and welcome back. It's been, I think a couple of years since we sat down, if I'm not mistaken. The last conversation was phenomenal. I will put whatever episode number that was in the intro. I forgot to look it up a second ago, but I want to welcome you back onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Yeah, man. Thanks. Good to be back. Good to see you.
So firstly, before we dive into all things topical, how have the last couple of years or so been on your end?
Crazy. To be honest with you, when I wrote this story, I had no idea how the EMS community was going to respond. You yourself were just, talking about, hey, my EMS journey began in Florida, and what I always heard was Florida and Los Angeles. And people are kind of, EMS is really particular about itself, and there's a lot of pride, understandably, in the history, and I wasn't sure how open people would be to the idea, but it's really been incredible. The medical community as a whole has been great, but the EMS community in particular has really embraced it. And I've been, along with several of the other guys, I've been traveling around, and I've done events all over the country, and people are really excited to hear the story. They're excited to sit down with those guys. So it's been kind of a whirlwind. And then in the midst of it, like, this new book came up, and so it's been busy. It's been busy.
Well, you're referring to the men of the Freedom House, the original, paramedics, really, in our history that a lot of us don't even know about. One of the best things that I've seen come on TV recently is The Pit, and they did a great job, obviously, with it being in Pittsburgh, of highlighting some of the historical elements, including, the Freedom House men they themselves. And I think one of the patients, I've got that right, is one of the original Freedom House men in this particular story. So for people that haven't heard the first episode that we did together, just going to give me an overview of, what that program was, and maybe the kind of the metamorphosis of that realization now, and the history lesson that a lot of us in EMS are getting.
Yeah. So if you go back to when the white paper comes out, we're kind of all familiar with that part of EMS lore, 1966, the idea that, people are dying unnecessarily. And the reason is either no one is there to handle their emergency, or the people who arrive are poorly trained. Most cities in America at that time, what you had were either the police, volunteer firefighters, or undertakers from the local funeral home. None of them had any training. It was basically just sort of, grab and go. And people were dying because of it. So that the white paper goes out, and a doctor by the name of Peter Saffer, who was in Pittsburgh, developed the paramedic curriculum, and he could not get anybody to join him in this endeavor. I mean, if you think about it, his sales pitch was, hey, walk away from your life for a year, take an incredibly difficult course that's based off of medical school that you might or might not pass. And when you finish it, you'll be qualified to do a job that technically doesn't exist. Not a lot of people say yes to that. So he had a difficult time. And eventually, where that search for the first paramedics landed was in a neighborhood in Pittsburgh called the Hill District. It was it was an all-black neighborhood. It was on particularly hard times, and people from that neighborhood who were referred to in the local press as unemployables. The city at that time had redlining covenants, so they couldn't even move out of that neighborhood if they wanted. It was illegal to sell your home if you lived in other neighborhoods to black people. So they were stuck in this place that had no services, no jobs, no opportunity, no anything. And along comes EMS. Along comes the opportunity to become a paramedic, which of course they'd never heard of, but they knew what they had at that moment, which was the police service, did not serve them very well. And so they stepped into the breach that all of us as a nation were basically begging for someone to do. And, they performed incredibly well, and they did it for a decade. And at the end of that decade, the city quite unceremoniously shut them down. But, out of that, dozen or 10 or so years that they were operating, so many firsts happened. I mean, just the creation of the paramedic, the creation of the paramedic curriculum, the establishment of a medical director, one of whom for them was Nancy Caroline, who wrote Emergency Care in the Streets, sort of the seminal textbook for so many people in this field. She wrote that book based on her experiences there with their assistants. The use of Narcan to reverse overdoses. They were the first ones to do that. The design of the ambulance, what they carried, how they were trained, how they were deployed, aspects of radio communications. It was all sort of field tested in this service. And other doctors were coming in from around the country. Other directors are coming in from around the country. They were seeing what they were doing. They were sort of borrowing bits and pieces of it, expanding on it, growing it, doing the thing that evolution does. Something pops up in the world, and then everybody sort of comes and grows it. And so, but that's the seed. That's where this all began. Even though by the time Johnny and Roy come along, and Emergency is this television show that inspired a generation of kids to become paramedics, by the time that show came along, these guys had been operating for years. So they're really, the inciting incident for paramedics as we know it, for EMS as we know it. And for nearly 50 years, their history had been sort of swept under the rug, and they were, banging a drum for anyone who would listen to say, hey, we've got this incredible story to tell someone, please listen. And, I just happen to be one of the people who got in and listened.
Now, I mentioned the pit. We're starting to see this story really gain some traction again. But when you reflect back now, having written the history of this, what were the elements behind the, to use a modern term, whitewashing of our history?
I think, so it starts with the city deciding, the city resisted them. They began operating in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So April of 1968. For the next 4.5, 5 years, the city essentially resists the idea that paramedicine is viable. They try to suggest that it's not even, practical to perform medicine in a moving vehicle. They try to say it's not cost effective. They try to say it's not necessary, and they do everything they can to hold it down. Meanwhile, all over the country, including, Los Angeles, where it inspires a television show, again, that inspires a generation of kids that people to this day line up in the hundreds to get, things signed by Johnny and Roy. While that's happening, while the paramedic is being turned into a hero on national television, with a beloved show and beloved characters. In the city where it's born, the government is trying to shut it down. And if you look at this service that is growing and expanding everywhere else, except for one place, and the only thing that differentiates Pittsburgh from every other city where EMS was growing is that in Pittsburgh, all the medics were Black. And you could say that's a coincidence. I would say that's one of the world's most remarkable coincidences, if it is one. So they resist it. And then finally, they reach a point where they can no longer resist it. The entire country has it. You can no longer say this isn't viable. In fact, people in Pittsburgh are watching this show on their televisions. So the city says, okay, fine, we'll create an EMS service. And they do. But they're not going to take any of the people from Freedom House, and they start all over again, even though these guys were the originals and everybody else had been borrowing from them. And the person who created their program is Peter Safar, nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the father of CPR, a bona fide medical genius, 20th century intellectual titan. They're not used. And brand new doctors and brand new people start over again from ground zero. And it fails. And so the city, scrambling, turns to Nancy Caroline, who was Freedom House medical director, as you know, the program is shutting down there in their last couple of weeks before it's going to be killed. And they said, please come and be our medical director where this is going under. And Nancy says, okay, fine, I'll join you, but you've got to do these things. And most of what she asked for was hire my people, allow them to practice at the current level, keep them in the shifts in the locations where they currently work. And her final ask was recognize publicly the service that Freedom House provided the city of Pittsburgh from 1968 to 1975. I've seen the letter she sent to the mayor, and I've seen the letter that the mayor wrote in response. He said yes to all of her demands except for the only one that was free, the one for him to publicly acknowledge the service that Freedom House had provided for the city of Pittsburgh. The second it was over with and Freedom House was closed in October of 1975, the city acted as if it never existed. And in every neighborhood except for the Hill, people sort of behaved like it never existed. And, you know, when I first went to research this story back in 2018, 2019, I was sitting in a cab and the cab driver was like, what are you doing here? And I told him what I was researching, and he'd never heard of it. A Black guy from the city of Pittsburgh had never heard this incredible piece of American history that, you know, he, as a Pittsburgher, as a Black man, this is a piece of history that was sort of really, you know, a part of his history, much like is a part of my history, part of your history. Anyone who's had their life changed by EMS, this is a part of your history. If you're an American, this is a part of your history. But he'd never heard it. So the city had done really a great job of sort of just wiping this away.
Well, I'm so glad that, you know, it's being unpacked, and credit to you. Obviously, the men were the ones that told the story, but I mean, you were certainly the conduit in this case for getting it back to where it needed to be. And then we have the Pit and some of these other, shows now that are televising this.
You got it. When it comes to the Pit, you know, they have local doctors that are consulting, and which is why it's so realistic, which is why you don't have people dropping organs on the floor and then picking them up and then transplanting them into a patient, as you do on other shows. It's an incredibly realistic show, and that's not done by accident. And it has a very specific local center, and that's Pittsburgh, and that's also not by accident. But you know, among those doctors were several that were familiar with Freedom House, that knew the Freedom House medics, and they said, "Hey, there's this great story that you guys should incorporate." And Noah Wiley immediately latched onto it, and you know, he said, "Yeah, let's do this. We've got to do it." And of course, the writers and and the producers, they were all on board as well. But they had a number of the Freedom House medics out. They afterwards sent me pictures, and they were standing there with Noah Wiley, which is, I mean, look, the guy was in ER. He, he's sort of an American icon. Who wouldn't want to meet him and shake his hand? And they gave him a copy of the book, which I thought was really fantastic. But really, take me out of it, take the book out of it. This was an opportunity for people who had served all of us with distinction to get some recognition. And I could not have been happier to see them standing there with Noah Wiley, to know that they were there while that episode was filmed, and then to see it on TV where all these people watch and go, wait a minute, what is Freedom House? And then people start Googling Freedom House. And, one of the widows said to me, my husband died without his kid knowing what he did. And I'd like to change that. And that has stuck with me, that this man's children were not aware of the full extent of what he'd been up to in the 1960s and 1970s. It's an important story, and, far too long went without people really knowing it.
What are you seeing now? I mean, you mentioned, a couple of examples, but what are you seeing as far as the growth of understanding within our profession itself?
I mean, look, these guys are being asked to go all over the country. They are attending EMS conferences, medical conferences. They're going to grand rounds at different hospital systems. Sometimes I'm there, sometimes I'm not. Quite frankly, when somebody in the medical community has a conference and I get invited, and John Moon or Mitch Brown or somebody standing next to me, like, I am old news, and I'm very happy to be old news. Those guys are the goods, and people are excited to see them. So to me, that's the big thing, is the way that the industry is embracing what they consider to be, the forebears of our profession. And it's gratifying. It's really gratifying.
Yeah, it's so good to see. I mean, there's a guy I always use an example, Professor Russell Foster, totally getting away from that subject, but he is the man who discovered the chronoreceptor in the eye, meaning you had rods and you had cones that we were taught about, when we were young in biology, but the receptor that can tell the circadian rhythm. So when you hear now influencers, air quotes, talking about when you first wake up, go outside, look at the sun, this is his research that they're quoting, but they never give any credit to him whatsoever. And he fought tooth and nail. The ophthalmology profession laughed at him over and over and over again. There's no other receptor. What are you talking about? Until he proved it in rats. And I think this is an important thing. When someone was literally the pioneer of whatever it was, and now other people are riding the coattails without giving them any credit or recognition, that needs to be changed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think if you sat down and asked these guys, what is it you want? Which, is a question I have asked. And, the reaction is simply understanding, acknowledgement, that we were here and we did this thing, and they admit at the time they were trying to serve their neighborhood. They were trying to serve their community. They were young guys. They didn't necessarily recognize that they were changing the world, because they were in one neighborhood in one city. They weren't seeing what was happening necessarily all over the country. But then, in 1971, 1972, Emergency comes out and they see it on television, and it's kind of like, oh my, like, wait a minute, what is happening? And they were very excited, very shocked, but mainly very excited. And I just don't think that they were anticipating that the world would pivot away from them, that they would just be sort of written out of the history. So, I think for them, more than anything else, is just recognition that in this time, in this place, these people stepped forward and did this thing.
Well, I think it's just such a good example of how completely fucking ridiculous racism is too. Yeah. Like, that guy could never be a paramedic because his pigmentation is darker and he's more muscular. Like, what? It makes no sense.
I know. Or like the fact that he does it, that the fact that he is the paramedic must mean that a paramedic is less valuable than it otherwise would be.
Yeah, exactly. Insane. Well, staying on entertainment for a second, between the last time we spoke and now, I watched Asphalt City. Have you seen that film?
No.
Interesting. So Sean Penn plays a burnt out
was
New York paramedic.
Rise at one point?
It sounds. I've literally listened to part of an interview you did just to kind of prep for this again. And the host mentioned, had you read Black Flies? And when he described what Black Flies was about, I'm like, I bet you that's what Asphalt City was based on. So yeah, very, very dark, very bleak.
Okay.
But it's the rawness that we need in the storytelling of fire and EMS, but completely devoid of any hope. So I think, if you go too far that way, you just paint us as a bunch of people that are basically going to end up in a coffin soon and not show the light that's involved as well.
Yeah, that's really, that always frustrates me. Like there's this notion, and anytime I've ever, I've been involved in a bunch of different EMS TV and film projects, and, the producers are always like, oh, these guys are one step away from death and all this, they're all ready to blow their brains. And I'm like, where are you guys getting this from? It's, it's like somebody told them 20 years ago, hey, this is what it's supposed to look like. And then they're all just sort of regurgitating it. That was my problem with the Scorsese movie was, the first 30 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever really felt like EMS, bringing out the dead. But then it kind of takes this crazy, dog leg, and it gets kind of dark, and I find it, because there's so much humor and there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of adrenaline and there's boredom and there's frustration and there is darkness. There are people who are really burned out, but I don't think everybody's really burned out. I've yet to, I've traveled all over the country and talked to EMS people. I don't find them to be like pasty with black rings under their eyes and just like dragging themselves unhappily through life, ready to jump off the next building. Like that's just not who we are as a community. I think we're, like oftentimes fucking crazy, and you got to like keep a leash on us, because if you allow us to wander among polite company, we might things might get ugly. But like we're as frustrated as we can get. We also, we're here because this thing is a calling. I talked about that in my book. Like you could make more money in almost any other kind of medicine. Like why are people here? What is it that draws people to this specifically? There are drier places, there are safer places, there are air conditioned places, there are heated places. So why are you here? Why are you on an ambulance? Why are you crouching in a street corner with your, flashlight in your teeth? Why is it that you're doing this and you're not somewhere else? And, there is a sense of service. And there's some weird thing that calls us to it. And I just think it all always misses that. And I find it, so I really have a hard time watching those depictions, because it's like, man, that's just not like, nobody who's ever done it really feels like this, Well,
that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to turn Kinder into a TV show at the moment. I say trying to. I am going, it is happening very, very slowly, but, come hell or high water, it will be there. But there is a character who is initially going through a dark place, but I wanted to illustrate the hope and healing that also goes hand in hand with that. And yes, you can be burnt down from a combination of childhood trauma and the insane shifts and sleep deprivation and organizational betrayal and some of these other things that do compound that, contribute to this suicide crisis that we do have. But if you end the sentence there, then it's like, oh, well, that's really sad.
Yeah.
But is the most important word. But they are preventable. If you start addressing each piece that contributes to this burnout, to this breakdown, whether it's in their own life or whether it's in the organization, the beautiful thing is you can forge an environment where a paramedic or a firefighter or a police officer can thrive, and they'll still be tired at the end of the shift, and there'll still be some stuff they got to process, but their world will be designed to allow them to work through that and then become more resilient, grow from it.
Yeah.
But I think, like you said, you either have the Tacoma FD where we're all a bunch of fucking idiots, which I've had the guys from that show on here too, or you have the Asphalt City where it's all doom and gloom. I think Code 3 did a good job of kind of balancing, the fun and the darkness a little bit. But I haven't seen anything really on screen yet, which is what I want to do. That's like, yeah, these are things, and if they're left unaddressed, yes, they result in funerals, but here's what we can do. Here's why we get there, and here's how you can not get there. And here's how you can look back at the generational trauma and all these other things. But whether it's us in the uniform or the people that we're responding to, it's the same conversation. Yeah. People will struggle if they're left to just drown on their own. Mm-hmm. But you teach them to swim and you give them a boat, all of a sudden they're thriving now, So I think that's the one I haven't really seen on the screen yet that I'm hoping to be able to bring.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wish you nothing but success in that regard. We may have more, more of that than other fields, but, meet a bunch of accountants. There's some depressed people there, go and, meet chefs, meet, doctors, used car salesmen. It doesn't matter the field. But for some reason, EMS is the only thing that gets a very one-note depiction. And it is, they're either kind of like buffoonish or it's just really dark. Or, you have sort of like the 911 thing, which is, they're in space. Like there was an episode where they were in space. I saw those promos and I was like, why are they in space?
That's a hell of a transport time.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, somebody's gonna be calling them with questions, but it is either this sort of buffoonish hero, buffoonish buffoon, or like very bleak. And I don't think any of those things are really indicative.
No. Well, what about in the real world? You have an unusual perspective, kind of like I do now, from the outside looking in, but still connected very much to that world itself. What are you hearing as far as, recruitment, retention, the desire to enter our profession? And how does that contrast, if at all, to when you were first pursuing this career?
I mean, I entered into this, in the aftermath of 9/11. Kids entering into it now aren't even alive in 9/11. I mean, think about that for a moment. I mean, that's just something I can't even wrap my head around, but that's the reality. So I entered into it at a time where there was this tremendous sense of, people wanted to be part of something bigger. There was a desire to serve. There was this notion that, we're all in this together. Let's, pull on the same oar. And, we don't, obviously the country's in a different place right now. We're like incredibly divided. And, but, to answer this question, I actually, I did an update to Strangers. There's a new chapter that I wrote, but in order to write it, I went back and did a ride along. And the place, where I worked, Grady, they reached a point where they had so few medics that they actually were running, for the first time in their history, they were running double EMT trucks, basic trucks. And then they would have paramedic chase cars. So if there was a bad call, the paramedic in a chase car would just go and drive and then hop on the ambulance and take the call, which, I mean, we had a number of double medic trucks, and certainly no truck ever would have gone anywhere without a paramedic. And that was a response to COVID. So many people left. So many people got burned out and frustrated. And, you can hang a sign above the door that says heroes work here, but if you treat people like shit, then they know damn well that heroes don't work here, or at least that's not how anybody sees it. So
heroes used to work here.
Yeah, exactly. The cosmic joke right there, which, one of the things I love about EMS is that like people, like our ability to laugh at our own horrible predicament, it's like, yeah, this sucks, but I kind of like how much it sucks. So I'm sure that everybody was laughing when they saw those heroes work here signs go up. But, you mentioned institutional betrayal. I mean, COVID really brought that to the fore. People being asked to go out and serve the public without proper equipment, without training, without the support, without the people necessary to make it happen. So I think that experience really decimated the ranks, and what it took away from from Grady in particular, but other services and other people I've talked to, is the experience. You can't you got someone who's been on the street for 5 years, 10, 15, 20 years. That person has something to teach, really something to teach. I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge and experience that have gone in their eyes and out through their hands, and they're ready now to teach it to you. And so when those people leave, when you lose them as an organization, you lose all that experience, you lose that history. And so much of what this is I mean, let's be honest, like, people stay at a place because they have pride in that particular place. Like our service, wherever you're living, our service, man, in this city, like we do this and we do this, and we're really good at it, and we give a damn, and we're not like these guys over here, who suck. Like when you don't get paid super well and your conditions just by design, like EMS, the conditions are always going to be hard. That's just how it is. In fact, that's why most of us want to do it. Like maybe you don't want to be in an emergency. You'd rather be in someone's living room. You'd rather be in the street, in an alley, wherever. These are like you're there on purpose, but it contributes to making the job hard. You take an incredible amount of pride in that, and the history of your organization builds and reflects that pride. So when you lose all those people, you lose that history, you lose that connection to something else. So new people coming in, I look at these new Grady medics, and I'm like, man, I feel bad for you. You don't have, like, when I started, there were guys from the 90s, the early 90s. And when they started, there were people from the early 80s and the 70s. Like we were one link in a chain removed from the origin. And some of our supervisors had started in 80, 81. There was this connection. There was a definitive line from how it started to how it was. And that created the culture, it created our attitude, it created the pride we took. Someone who, was working in Grady in the 80s when it was the murder capital, like that, and there were no medics, and there were just tons of calls, and, they were just running like crazy and getting paid crap. But there, because they had pride in what they did, if you showed up and you sucked at your job, like you would get chewed out by some 55-year-old guy, sitting there smoking a cigarette in some like threadbare bomber jacket with a patch on his arm from 91, and he's just like bawling you out because he remembers how this is supposed to be. When you lose those people, you lose so much. And so that, to me, I think is a lot of what has walked out the door is the history, the pride, experience, of course, but the culture of EMS is something that gets passed along. COVID really did a number on that.
The other thing I think if we're talking about COVID that I thought was disgusting is, and I transitioned out like literally a couple of years before, so my timing was good. But you had these people that were out there unprotected, minimal PPE. And then what was it? Not even a year later, now they're being called murderers if they didn't have the vaccine. And you talk about organizational betrayal. You were fine hiding in your house while these people were out in the front line, in the streets, in the hospitals, with no vaccine then. And you were just totally okay with that. And now all of a sudden you have the audacity to call a police officer or a firefighter or a paramedic a murderer because they're not having a vaccine. And then fast forward another couple of years, it is proven that the efficacy of that vaccine wasn't even close to what everyone was being told. And let me be very clear. I had the vaccine so I could go travel and see my 105-year-old grandmother in England. So I didn't think it was going to make my head explode, but I wouldn't have had it done had I not traveled. So, standing in the middle, but the fact that then people were terminated for not having the vaccine, that I think, was like the Afghanistan withdrawal. If there was any trust before, you just completely destroyed it with not standing behind your people and advocating for them after they had been completely, naked as far as any sort of protection. And then there's this 180, and now you're firing them for not having this vaccine. So I think the leaders in the unions and the organizations need to look in the mirror and realize they are a big part of the recruitment crisis, and that is a massive piece, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, I got the vaccine. I just generally speaking, I'm a believer in them. The reason that we don't have polio is because our parents and our grandparents got the polio vaccine. But that was, COVID was history being made. It was, the future arriving an hour early and us trying to figure out how to handle it. And we didn't handle it well. I mean, even, forget for a moment the deniers. I have a hard time with, it would be like, I don't understand auto mechanics. That doesn't mean I don't believe that a fuel injector injects fuel. I don't understand how it works, but I know it works, and I'm willing to accept that it happens. But anyone, people who were well-intentioned and were trying their best to figure out how to proceed were, missteps are going to happen in a situation like that. But you need to be really open about it and say, like, hey guys, here's a mistake we made. As it turns out, kids weren't a big vector. Why is that? I have no idea, because I'll tell you right now, if there's a measles outbreak in my area, I'm not sending my kids to school because they're all going to get measles. For whatever reason, COVID did not run rampant through schools, even though it ran rampant through funerals and and retirement homes and all these. So why was one community or one population more than others? We don't know. I'm sure somebody knows. I don't know. But as those mistakes were made, I don't feel like we were always, really forthcoming, and that breeds distrust, and distrust breeds, all the fear and everything else that came up. And, it's just, it seems like, but human history, I mean, you go back when cholera was discovered in the 1830s, people didn't think cholera was real. The flu pandemic that swept the world in the turn of the 20th century, people were not convinced that was real. 2014, Ebola epidemic completely washes over 3 nations in West Africa. There are people there who don't believe it's real, even though their neighbors are literally being burned in the street because nobody has anywhere to put these bodies. They still don't believe it's real because there's a lack of trust in the government. At some point, you got to turn to people and say, like, man, like, if you're in the government, what have we done wrong that people can look at a stack of corpses being burned in the street and not believe that the disease that caused it is really the disease that caused it? Where did that trust go? And I think communication is like the number one thing that everybody always gets wrong.
Well, the biggest thing, I think, was after the fact, like you said. Here's what we did right. Here's what we did wrong. And one of the things that to this day, as we're sitting here on, February, whatever it is, on 2026, still isn't being addressed is, well, the one truth during COVID was the healthier you are, the higher chance there is of you surviving getting COVID, or even not even noticing that you had COVID. And, what are most kids? They're healthy. They don't have pre-existing conditions yet. So I think that's a big common denominator.
Yeah.
And that also completely aligns with the burnout of our fire and EMS. No one talks about the fact that this country is basically 3/4 overweight or obese, almost half obese, clinically obese. So coming out of a pandemic that clearly, if you are hypertensive, diabetic, all these things, these pre-existing conditions, smoker, that there's a much higher chance that you're going to get killed. If there was one takeaway, it's like, well, we need to make our nation healthier. And even if you look at the Spanish flu, that was World War I time, that was, poverty and, not the hygiene conditions that we have now. So same kind of thing, but not obesity, just, compromised immune systems from a different way. So what really pisses me off is why, as we came out of COVID, there wasn't a conversation like, look, our country is incredibly overweight and unhealthy. We have a profit-based healthcare system. Our EMS and hospitals are literally crumbling as we speak. We need to put real food back in schools. We need to bolster PE programs. We need to give local farmers incentives to grow healthy food. We need to, pedestrianize downtown areas, put more public transport in so that we can match other countries that are doing this kind of thing and they have a very healthy population. That would help the EMS side. That would help, whatever the next virus is called. But there was none of that. The opposite, because, there's no money in healthy people, or very little money. The money is all in the sick. And I think that's one thing that we as a nation really have to push back on. And it's not a left thing. It's not a right thing. But over the last 30 years, we have got fatter and fatter and sicker. And that is one, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why, our hospitals and our EMS systems are crumbling, because more and more and more people are calling 911, and more and more people are filling triage in hospitals.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt about that. But you're right. There's no there's no money in doing that. In fact, it's the opposite, because if you're going to try to make downtowns walkable, you got to spend money. For public transportation, you got to spend money. You look at like our food pyramid's kind of out of whack. Tons of money is being dumped into like things that getting farmers to grow tons of one thing that we don't need, or paying them to not grow some other thing. It's like kind of blows your mind. And then you look at, one of these documentaries about these blue zones, they don't eat any of the things that we eat. And really what it comes down to is like a limited amount of food, daily exercise, community. And these are things that we lack. We don't eat unprocessed whole foods in reasonable quantities. We don't get normal, and I'm not talking CrossFit nonsense, but like normal activity type exercise. I mean, there was, in one of those documentaries that there was a guy, he's 105 or something. And they said, why are you so, why do you think people in this area live so long? And he talked about the fact that they sit on the floor to eat. This was in Japan. And he said, you can't be unhealthy. You can't have bad joints. You can't be overweight. You can't be out of shape and get on the floor and get up again at 97. You like, it requires, not even tons of work, but it requires you to be a certain type. It requires, the constant energy and effort, and requires you to be reasonably healthy. And then of course, community, like we seem to be almost like actively working against community, like finding ways to tear community apart, whether it's the design of cities or, like the lunacy that is social media right now. I don't know. It's it's like we are a study in how to shorten your lifespan. We're very successful at it. Like, we're working hard. We sure are. We're working hard.
I saw a few times that I don't know if it was based on a study, but I mean, forget science, it just makes sense. But the biggest predictor of health, longevity, wasn't exercise level, wasn't even nutrition, it was community. Because if you feel connected to people, when you said CrossFit, one of the biggest selling points of CrossFit was not thrashing yourself to death, but it was being in a room with other people that was suffering together. And a lot of times, I know it's kind of counterintuitive, but then people will go from CrossFit and they'll go sit in a brewery for an hour and talk and, have a post-workout beer. That is the big thing. Spartan races, same thing. You know what I mean? It's not so much about, this is hard climbing this fence. It's that you're doing it together. And, there's a veteran who's missing a leg. Let's help him get over this wall. That's the bit that's missing. And I can't help but feel like it is deliberately orchestrated, the fracturing of community, because the age-old saying, united we stand, divided we fall, and we're falling at the moment.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, all that is the case, and here we are. And here we are.
But I'm a what I call angry optimist. I truly believe that the silent majority in the middle, we're starting to kind of find our feet and find our voice again. I think there's going to be finally a pushback, because people, I think, are realizing, the right wing, the left wing, same bird, as they say. So, I think the list has helped a lot with these billionaire James Bond villains that we have at the moment, seeing them fall, and people realizing, well, none of this is actually benefiting us, our community, our schools, our safety, etc. So I hope that you have to hit rock bottom before you bounce up again, and I hope we're about to ascend again as a population, because I mean, it's pretty sad seeing what should be people just enjoying their life, like you said, at each other's throats over a freaking politician that doesn't give a shit about them, or over whether they wore a mask or not, or whether one particular police incident defines the entire profession. So I'm looking forward to us coming together again. You alluded to 9/11, as the phrase goes. I miss 9/12, and we need to find that again.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, I'm not quite as hopeful as you are in the moment.
Most people aren't.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it, but I think I don't know. Even the mask conversation, some of it to a degree, we spent a lot of time lionizing, the greatest generation. What is it that we celebrate them for? It's not even so much that they won a war, which they clearly did, or necessarily that they came through the Depression and had been sort of forged in this national hardship, but it was that they sacrificed for everybody else around them.
Mm-hmm.
And there is at the moment an unwillingness to even inconvenience yourself for somebody else, let alone sacrifice for somebody else. And that to me was that was the big thing that really struck me, during COVID. I mean, look, you're in medicine, I'm in medicine. I'm well aware that a surgical mask is not going to stop whatever you have from coming to me. But I'm also aware that 30 years ago, before any of this was political, your surgeon would have worn a surgical mask, hence the name, to give you surgery, because we knew and we had known for 100 years that what you breathe out goes into other people. And if you block what you breathe out, then it doesn't, then you can limit the exposure of everyone around you to whatever germs you have. That was just accepted. And, we allowed ourselves to sort of be baited into this angry argument that really didn't serve anybody. But what it produced was this idea of like, I'm not going to inconvenience myself in the least for you. And I don't care if you think it's going to make you better or somebody else tells me it's going to help you. I just don't feel like it. And that was the frustrating thing, was just, I think for all of our celebration of previous generations and their sacrifices, I think future generations will probably look at us and say, wow, it's a really selfish time, whatever side of the political spectrum you are on, because they all have faults. Both sides are constantly doing something that you kind of go, really? But what is lacking, the unifying problem that I see is this inability to sacrifice for others. When I was talking to marketing people for my book, that's the new one. One of them said, like the whole thing is the virus and the rescue, all that's cool and it's exciting. She said, but what stood out to me was people risking their lives for strangers. And she said, the question that this book asked me was, what are we willing to die for? And are we ever going to have heroes again? And we do feel like we're in a time where, what are we willing to die for? Not a damn thing that isn't specific to me. Are there heroes anymore? I don't know if I believe in heroes. Heroes are fake news. It's really, I don't know. It's a little cynical. It feels a little self-centered. I have children, so, I really want to see improvement. I want to see us come together collectively because, they're this sort of wandering out into this world. And I don't want us to leave it worse than we could have. They're already going to have enough challenges. I don't know. Hopefully we can kind of right the ship, but I don't know how hopeful I am right now that we're getting there.
Well, I think this is also why it's important for our profession to tell stories, because if you talk about selflessness, I would, not putting ourselves on a pedestal specifically, but the profession as a whole, you kiss your loved ones goodbye, you go away for 12 or 24 hours and you serve, complete strangers. And I always try to work in the most desperate parts of town too, because I felt like that was where the greatest need was. So we are kind of barometers on, what service should look like. how the country is actually doing behind the curtain. And so the more, like you said, that aren't this kind of, no disrespect to Chicago Fire, but the kind of, soap opera storytelling. And I had the founder, the creator of that on. I know he wants it to be a lot more raw, but Hollywood curves the edges of his stories. But I think we're not really a voice. There's no Jocko Willink of Fire and EMS, for example. You know what I mean? We don't have those pieces, those faces. So I think that we are a profession that maybe can kind of shift it a little bit and bring everyone back to the middle and say, well, this is what service is supposed to look like. Because even as we sit here now, we don't have many members of our military that are really in combat at the moment, which is a phenomenal thing. And that used to be one of the bigger voices of the last 10 plus years. So now it's the people that are on the streets every day. It's us, or our, the next generation of our profession. So I think that we have a really good opportunity to be one of the storytellers, one of the kind of perspectives on what selflessness and service looks like, who's really struggling, how we can help them, how compassion and empathy is going to work, and division and nastiness and hate isn't. I mean, we live that. That's the meat grinder that we occupy. So I think that, that your book and my book and some of the other ones that are out there and some of the shows, there's so much that we could do, not just showing, the cool stories of the fire or EMS world, but the human stories in the uniforms and the people that we serve.
Yeah. One of the things that drives me nuts is this push by, sort of medical academia or administrations to refer to patients as clients. And I know it has, I'm sure it's an insurance thing, and it's a JCO thing, and it's a billing thing, and all these other, but like, I wouldn't let a customer puke on me. I wouldn't let a customer take a swing at me, but what I'm willing to endure for my patients, the patients have thrown up on me. I haven't blinked, it's like, I don't enjoy it. It's not like, if I can dodge it, I will. And, all the better if I can dodge it so my partner doesn't see it coming and he gets splattered, so we can laugh about it later. But, what you're willing to accept from a patient is a whole lot more than you'd accept from anyone else. And it's because of that notion, like, what are you here for? Why did you show up today? Well, showed up to serve my community, and that's, I don't know anybody who works the job who doesn't take that part of it very seriously. So, maybe Absolutely. You're right. Maybe that's where maybe we need to be the example.
I think so. Well, you mentioned Ebola, so that's a good segue. Talk to me about the genesis. What was the nucleus of even pursuing this story? And then let's talk about No One's Coming.
So they're two brothers. And back in the early 80s, they started this very strange company. And one of them, when he was in college, worked summers on an ambulance. And somebody sent him a copy of Strangers. And he shoots me this email years ago, 2017 maybe. And he said, hey, read this book. A friend of mine sent it to me, told me a story that he worked, back in the crazy mid-70s days of EMS, where they were like stealing patients from each other, and all the madness that was going on, sort of Mother Jugs and Speed world. And we just kept in contact because he, the company that he and his brother started if I say aviation company, what goes to your mind is like Boeing. But this is a company that it's very, very, very small. It's in the hinterlands of North Georgia, and they have stayed alive by specializing in doing the things that nobody else will do. And in aviation, what that means is flying things nobody else wants to fly. And that might be things that go boom, or it might be human beings that go boom. So essentially it's explosives and infectious disease, which who the hell wants to be in a plane over the Atlantic with either a load of dynamite or somebody with SARS? That does not sound appealing to me, but that's how they carve their niche. So I found this intriguing. We stayed in contact, and I was in Atlanta, and he said, "Hey, why don't you come out and we'll show you what we do." And I was walking around their hangars, and there was this rectangle of this worn, battered, torn rectangle that was about 5 feet wide and 8 feet long on the floor of this hangar. And I saw it, and I was like, what is that? And they sort of, in passing, said, "Yeah, well, the CDC asked us to develop this biocontainment unit that would fit inside of a jet. And we had no idea how to do it, but we had to act very quickly to develop this technology. And the first thing our engineers did was they paced out exactly how little room they had to work with on the floor of a hangar. And they did it with duct tape, and that's it right there." And when he said that, what came to my mind is that scene in Apollo 13 where that engineer says, "We got to fit this, and it's round and small, into this, and it's huge and square, using nothing but this, and it's just like a pile of junk on a table. And we've got 2 hours to do it. Get started." That's how that moment felt of an engineer laying duct tape on the floor of a hangar to pace out how little room he had in which to devise a containment system that could hold the scariest diseases on Earth for 10, 12, 24 hours of airborne flight. And I knew that they had been involved in Ebola evacuations. I didn't realize that they were the Ebola evacuations, that they were it. But that was the germ. The minute I heard that, I said, that, right, like, I just knew instinctively. I mean, you're a writer, like, instinctively when you're sitting on a story, and that one scene, the desperation of, a handful of people in a hangar pacing out how little room they have to devise a piece of never before seen technology. Like, everything else around this story is going to be fascinating. So that was the germ right there.
So talk to me about the story then. What is the mission that you write about in the book?
So in the summer of 2014, July of 2014, this guy by the name of Dent Thompson, one of the two brothers, Mark and Dent, are the guys who started this company called Phoenix Air. Dent Thompson is sitting on his deck. He's on vacation. It's late afternoon, like 3:30, 4 o'clock. He's got a beer and a magazine. He walks outside. He sits down in a chair. He had this place in the Blue Ridge Mountains. When you sit out on his deck, you could see for like 100 miles. His parents had built it. Nothing but trees and hills, full expanse of the Tennessee Divide. And totally relaxed. And his phone rings. He looks down. It's a Washington, D.C. area code. And he answers. And the voice on the other end of the phone says to him, "This is William Walters from the State Department. There are Americans, we're not sure how many, dying of Ebola in Africa. We're not exactly sure where. We have tried every other means possible to get them home and failed. You are their last option. You have about 5 minutes to decide if you'll do this. I'll call you back." Click. And that is how their story begins. Not knowing a damn thing about Ebola, not knowing if they want to do this, if they should do this, if they possibly can do this. But then also knowing that Ebola kills in about 10 days, and the people dying were already several days into this 10-day window. So if they were going to say yes, I had to say yes now. And so the story is the next few days following that phone call and this insane rescue mission to get these doctors home and to try to save their lives in the midst of the deadliest Ebola outbreak in world history.
So talk to me about who the doctors were and what they were doing over there in the first place.
So back up really quickly. 1976, we discover Ebola. It appears twice, almost simultaneously. Once in Sudan, another in at that time, just Congo, now Democratic Republic of Congo. And then disappears, basically runs through its number of available hosts and goes back underground. By the time scientists arrive, there's very little for them to study. This pattern continues for the next couple decades. By 2014, we know almost nothing about Ebola. We know that it's a hemorrhagic fever. We know that we have some suspicions about maybe where it comes from. We don't know why it disappears. We don't know why it necessarily comes back. Sometimes it will be gone for a week and appear in another country. Other times it'll be gone for a year without coming back. Mortality rates are all over the place. Sometimes 40%, sometimes 90%. So, this virus, it is, it's kind of like a serial killer. It just, when it's not killing, it is gone. And then all of a sudden it reemerges and immediately starts ravaging the population. The one thing they thought they understood, they didn't have a treatment, there's no vaccine, no cure. The one thing they thought they understood was that wherever it came from, it was clearly its vector only lived in incredibly remote places. It was not thought that it could appear in a highly developed area. So December 2013, a child gets it in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Guinea. That kid becomes essentially patient zero. The virus very quickly spreads to 3 different countries. So almost out of nowhere, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia are completely overrun with this virus. Healthcare systems in all 3 countries collapse. There are local doctors and local nurses who are fighting, but they're totally outmatched. Ebola is referred to as the provider's disease because everything that comes out of your body, and everything comes out of your body, blood, sweat, vomit, diarrhea, everything, and it is a constant flow of fluids. Those are all incredibly infectious. It takes the tiniest part per million in order to infect somebody. And unfortunately, every drop of blood has millions of parts per million. It's just, each drop is overloaded with this virus. So it takes almost nothing, but it always arrives with everything. So, those doctors are getting sick. The world, governments, generally speaking, militaries, that nobody's really taking note. Not in Africa, not in Europe, not in the US. Not in Asia. So a couple volunteer organizations, Doctors Without Borders and an organization called Samaritan's Purse, are fighting it. 2 organizations in 3 countries. In Liberia, Monrovia is the capital, 1 million people. Samaritan's Purse is manning the last hospital in that city of 1 million people, the last hospital. And they are doing it with less than a dozen doctors, most of them young, experienced with viruses, but none of them have ever worked with Ebola. The city is, it is close to complete collapse. Fear, chaos, violence, all the things that happen with every outbreak are happening. And more and more patients are showing up. And there's only a couple doctors in a very small treatment area to treat them. So they're totally overrun. And that's who so the 2 Americans who got sick, one's a physician named Kent Brantley. One was just a volunteer named Nancy Reipel. But they, neither one of them were epidemiologists. Neither one of them were experienced in this. But they were there when this outbreak hit, and they stayed to try to, they were the finger in the dam as the dam was collapsing around them, and they got sick.
As we sit here now in 2026, do they know now what the origin of Ebola was? Was it coming from other animals, or was it coming from some sort of untreated human waste? I mean, some of the other places that we know diseases originally sprouted from.
Yeah, it comes from animals. There's a bat that's sort of widely considered kind of the main culprit, but you can, maybe you eat the bat, you eat something that ate the bat, you ate a piece of fruit that the bat either bit or pooped on, and you get it. But where did the bat get it from? Why don't all the bats have it? Why is it that when this virus goes away, we can't find more bats with it? And then why does it come back to these bats? There are certain mysteries that attend to this. We'd certainly know a lot more now. We've developed from the 2014 outbreak, we have developed medicines to try to combat it. But really, this is a virus that requires ICU care. It requires really good supportive care, which in a country where you have the doctor to resident ratio is really, really, really low. And who's medical in a country where the medical system is not terribly robust, that sort of ICU care is just not going to be available. And so, if you talk to the people who go to these places, what they will all tell you is that, in a perfect world, we'd be capacity building. In a perfect world, we'd be bringing, the people living in this country up to speed with us. We would, like their infrastructure would be building itself, and they would be creating a system in which they can combat it. Absent that, then the rest of the world is going to have to help. And this was, sort of one of those examples of we all waited far too long to step in. And I think maybe the presumption was, well, it's happening there, it's not going to get here. But, each of these three countries has an international airport, and those planes are taking off every day. And every country on earth has an international airport, and those planes are taking off every day. And if you think that someone's sick 5,000 miles away from you, does not mean that there won't be, in just a few hours, someone sick standing right next to you, then maybe you haven't noticed how air travel works. But, it was sort of, in a lot of ways, it was the perfect storm. But we've learned some things from it. We've gotten a little bit better. I mean, that was, one of the things that was helpful was that when these Americans came back, the hospital that treated them was able to draw labs, and they were able to look at what was going on with them. And they said, okay, all right, well, we can see what helps. And so they were calling their counterparts in Africa and saying, try this. And they would say, well, you sure we can give that? We don't know what their labs work and what their labs look like. And the doctor's saying, trust me, like their labs are awful, give this, and it will be helpful. So we learned a lot, but, at the cost of many, many lives.
So you mentioned about this one organization being the kind of Hail Mary when it came to aviation. What was stopping other airlines from helping, or military or other organizations prior to that?
For whatever reason, maybe it's no great mystery, militaries are not interested in getting involved in infectious disease. To this day, this company is kind of really the only answer when it comes to transporting infectious disease by plane. Governments are not horribly excited about the idea of it. The WHO, who since they have people all over the world, they don't do it. The CDC, the reason that this technology exists is because the CDC paid this company, Phoenix Air, to create this technology so that they wouldn't have to do it. Governments don't really want to be in the business of driving around the world with SARS or measles or H1N1. That's just not what they want to be doing. So it falls to someone like this, someone who says, well, I've got this little company, and how do I compete with much larger, much richer companies? Well, I do things that they're not willing to do. I fly dynamite. I fly warheads. I fly batches of grenades. I fly, anything that will explode. And then I move into the medical field, and I fly the thing that nobody else wants to fly, which is, of course, people with something catching. So, that was how they did it. But it was because because nobody else wanted to do it that they were able to, make this mark, and that they happen to be in this position to do this. Once the flights are announced and everybody knows, like, okay, this is going to happen, this is a thing, it immediately turns into a huge problem. I mean, at one point, the state of Maine threatens to arrest a State Department official for assisting with the flights. The FBI is involved, and they actually have helicopters and vans following the ambulance carrying the first patient through the city of Atlanta, because the fear was that someone, if you think about this for a moment, the fear was that somebody may kidnap this patient and try to weaponize his body. And that was a legitimate fear. There were the hospital, Emory University Hospital, where they were being treated, had rings of protesters around it. They had to set up a separate post office because they were getting so many sort of unmarked packages that arrived, and nobody knew if any of these things were going to be bombs. So each of these packages had to be screened. There were letters coming in. There were political figures who were saying, like, well, hold on, you can't do this, because if you treat Ebola and then you wash your hands of Ebola blood, that blood's going to go down the sink, and then that is going to go into the drains, and that's going to go into the sewers, and that's going to hit rats, and your rats are going to have Ebola, and then rats are going to come charging out of the streets with Ebola, and you're going to have this huge, I mean, and, and people are angry that we're bringing them back. People are, in some cases, violently angry that we're bringing them back. There are government agencies trying to stop this from happening. There are private citizens trying to stop this from happening. The fear that surrounded this was tremendous. It's like that scene in Jaws where the mayor says, if you yell Barracuda, people will say, huh? But if you yell shark, everybody will panic. And it's the same way. If you yell Marburg, nobody's going to say anything. But if you yell Ebola, well, now you've got everybody's attention. And, this company, these guys, what makes them so great is this group of cowboys who are just willing and in many cases eager to do things that nobody else wants to do. And so when a call comes in to, fly into Libya to pick up Muammar Gaddafi's suitcase nuke or to fly an Ebola patient, the response is always, yep, I'd like to do that. Hey, thank God we have them. But yeah, they're just sort of crazy guys who are always willing to take on this impossible challenge.
I think it was when I was at Orange County. I remember either one or two departments I was issued, a class, I think it was a class B suit for Ebola that we carried around. It was like a little messenger bag, a little triangle one. Luckily, never had to deploy it. But I remember back then, looking it up and kind of what we were talking about with COVID before, it seemed to be more dangerous again to the immunocompromised that you would see maybe in places that are, malnourished, that kind of thing. Is that truth, or is that a mythology around the danger of Ebola in, for example, a developed city in the US?
The chances of catching it are huge if you're exposed to it. Look at the two nurses in Dallas. If you remember, a guy flew in during this outbreak from West Africa. He had it, did not realize he had it till he got to Dallas, was treated at a hospital. The hospital was not prepared to handle it, and two of the nurses treating him got sick. Both of those nurses lived. And again, because, aggressive supportive care is what saves these people. You're talking about a virus that either sort of simultaneously causes bleeding and hypercoagulation, massive amounts of fluid loss. So you have to, you got to monitor electrolytes. You got to replace that fluid. You got to deal with either tons of clots or tons of bleeding. And you've got to reduce the oxygen demand. These are things that, a modern healthcare system is equipped to deal with. But you have very little time before these people begin to slip toward organ failure. It happens, it kills very, very quickly. So, you've only got a couple of days to sort of bring somebody back from the brink with supportive care. So if in a place where that just doesn't exist, it becomes a crapshoot, and it becomes a thing where you have an 80% mortality rate, which if you think about that for a moment, you live in a street with 10 people, a virus kills 8 of them. That is terrifying. And that's the thing that people are facing in these 3 countries.
Well, the irony is that's the same ratio almost that obesity kills in America, when no one even raises an eyebrow on that. The premature deaths we have from that, but hey.
Yeah.
Well, what about, you mentioned two nurses in Dallas, yet we have all these thousands of flights around the world. What was it that curbed that epidemic and then, the spread, whether it was within Africa itself or even overseas?
So these two, one by one, the technology that Phoenix Air had could only transport one person at a time. So the rescue becomes this very complicated game of international telephone. But they're, within a couple of weeks, they are saved. And the doctor, Kent Brantley, went and testified before Congress. And he said, he basically shamed them. And he said, you have 2 volunteer aid organizations that are the entirety of the world's Ebola response, while 3 nations are dying. You were all sitting back and you were allowing the volunteers from two different organizations to do your work for you. Around this time, a man boarded a plane in Monrovia and he flew into Nairobi, the most populous city in Africa. And he had Ebola. And what was lucky was that, that country, he flies into Kenya. They had recently done a bunch of polio eradication work. And so they had this really good contact tracing network, and they put it into use. And they were able to trace his contacts. But there were still a number of people who died. Dozens got sick, but only a couple died. It could have been significantly worse. If that had landed and they had not been ready to use it, think for a moment, a city of nearly 30 million people, what a virus like that would do. It would just be, it'd be catastrophic. It was these Americans coming home. It was the world seeing it. It was the world's foremost expert was a doctor from Sierra Leone by the last name of Khan, who died. And so, the world's experts were watching people doctors either get rescued or killed from Ebola, from trying to stop Ebola, and realizing, okay, we're going to have to do something. And then sort of being, basically being shamed and chastised for a slow effort. They got involved. And then so the world began sending people over to try to fight it. And, it was that effort of bringing in supplies, bringing in all the things you would need for aggressive supportive care. And then, contact tracing and, all the stuff we learned or that we later used in COVID of like trying to keep people separated. And, what happens when someone gets sick? They want to go home. And when you go home and you're sick, what happens? Your family comes to you and help you. So if you live in a house with 3 generations living in that house, all those people are going to get sick because you're sick and they're trying to help you. And so, trying to prevent that from happening, keep the sick separated from the healthy, and supporting and caring for the people once they got it. It eventually works, but it took a year to bring the whole thing to a close.
We were talking about the Men of Freedom House and the lack of, acknowledgement of their service. What about this organization, this crew, and what they did? How much exposure did it get?
It's funny. I think they were quite snake bitten, because when it first happened, when their name got released to the public, they were not ready for that. And so suddenly their offices are surrounded by news cameras. 2, as I said, there was a really angry response. And I think they did their best to try to hide and say, well, look, we're just trying to help here, man. Like, what are we supposed to do? And, they were also terrified. Their employees were flying without knowing anything about Ebola repeatedly into a hot zone to rescue people. There was a real fear that, will they get sick? Will they make us sick? Will we make a mistake and get somebody else sick? When you talk to the doctors and nurses involved in it, they will tell you that their number one fear was contracting Ebola and then giving it to somebody else. So they're sort of, really inundated with external and internal fear. And I think they did their best to try to keep their heads down. They wound up giving a press conference just to sort of get the news off their back a little bit. But, by that point, the world had sort of cued into, there's this thing going on. And, the attention was pretty nonstop and pretty glaring. Although, and rightly, a lot of the attention went to the people who were fighting it in Africa. If you remember, Time named their People of the Year the doctors who were fighting Ebola. So, the African doctors, African nurses, foreign doctors and nurses, Kent Brantley included among them. So the world sort of paid a bit more attention to the people who were on the ground in Africa fighting the virus.
And then finally, and then we'll go to where people can find the book. what impact? So you're bringing these doctors back. You're able to draw bloods. Now you can create a treatment plan, understanding contact tracing. What impact did that have back at ground zero again on the people in Africa themselves?
Huge. I mean, one, it's telling people that, hey, the world is paying attention. Two, if you let's just say you live in some place wherever your hometown is, there's an outbreak there, and people come to help, and the people who come immediately get sick. Among the first things that would go through your mind is, well, we needed them, and they're sick, so they're no longer being helpful. But will anybody else come behind them? Because the last group of volunteers all got sick. So there's real concern that if you just allow the people coming in to help to die, then nobody else is going to come in to help. And this region is in real trouble. So I think some of it was a sense of hope that the world was both awakening to their plight, but also was dedicated to try doing their best to keep doctors safe, both African and foreign doctors. But I think a hospital system with all of the benefits of a modern ICU, being able to look at all the labs and everything that's going on. And every day they were having phone calls, and they would call back up and they would say, okay, give this medicine. We gave this medicine today because what we noticed was that, the liver labs were way out of whack. And so we're immediately giving this to keep that under control. So even though you guys aren't able to draw those labs, just go ahead and give this medication. So they were sort of able to guide the treatment based on what they were seeing on the ground, knowing that they were essentially serving the same patient population. And that was a big boost to it. But then again, honestly, so much of it came down to the world finally saying, okay, we'll help, and sending their experts and their supplies to try to, keep this, get this virus under control.
Beautiful. So the community that we talked about a while ago.
Yeah. Who'd have thought? Who'd have thought? Who'd have thought we're all in this together?
Exactly. Crazy. And if we all roll our sleeves up and help each other, the world gets better. It's bizarre.
Yeah, it is.
So the book is called No One's Coming. Tell people when it's coming out and where they can find it.
Publishes March 3rd. You can pre-order now, which, I've been doing my best to tell people because, why would anybody know the boring intricacies of publishing? But, a publisher puts their effort behind something based on the excitement it generates before it comes out. So all the help we can get now is huge. So pre-orders, love them. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any independent local bookstore that you have, Books A Million, it's everywhere. It can be ordered from all those places. And if you order it now, it'll be ready for you on March 3rd. And if you do it, pre-order it. Email me your screenshot, and I will use your address to ship you a sticker and a signed book plate as my thank you for helping the effort. But I think this is an important story. It's about a group of people who risk their lives to save strangers. Their philosophy long before this thing came up was that, we go to difficult places to do difficult things. And they really had to put their money where their mouth is in this particular case, because unlike many other situations, they were legitimately risking their lives to do this. And we talk about it all the time in first responder and EMS community, that sort of we run in while everybody else runs out. Well, this is a story of people really doing that. And in sort of very dramatic fashion. I think it's something that, a lot of people could use. Obviously, if you're a firefighter, if you're a paramedic, you're doing that, but not everybody else is. Not everybody always sees that. And, I think it's such an important story, particularly now. I think there's a lot of questions about the future of public health and all these things. Preparedness is everything. A virus overtakes a country because it's not prepared, whether that's its own fault or not. Somebody is there to step in to save your life because they are prepared. That is the difference in whether or not people live or die is our preparedness. And is really at the heart of this story is those two things, a willingness to sacrifice for others and being ready for even the unlikely scenario that we all know eventually will be here. Viruses do not live on a timeline. They live on a spiral, and everything that has been will be back again. And we could put our heads in the sand, or we can acknowledge that it's a reality, and we could try to prepare ourselves and fight back.
Absolutely. And GLP-1s on their own are not the solution. They just make drug companies even more money.
Yeah, bang that drum, baby.
All right, so that's your book, American Sirens and Thousand Naked Strangers. I'm assuming you can find the same places as well.
Oh yeah.
Brilliant. So first of the closing questions, is there a book written by someone else that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
Oh, all right. Gosh, I have so many. I'm surrounded by my books. Let me think of the one. So here's one. So this guy is a fantastic reporter, and he wrote this book about this massive wildfire in Canada, in Western Canada. It was moving so quickly that a house would go from perfectly fine to nothing but ashes in under 5 minutes. And he talks about the conditions that created that fire. Again, a lack of preparedness in the community to deal with it, and what the implications are for the future and how we need to look at these things. I mean, we just watched Los Angeles burn, huge swaths of it. Flooding in North Carolina. Natural disasters are a fact of life, and not something that we put a lot of forethought into. But this book, such an incredible story of this, just of the firefighters who are doing what they can to try to save their community in impossible odds. It's an incredible book. I cannot recommend it enough.
And just because most people will be listening to this on audio, so it's called Fire Weather.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. It's called Fire Weather. The writer is John Valiant. He wrote this insane story about a tiger. You can also read that book. It's called The Tiger. Way more than you ever wanted to know about tigers, but it will blow your mind.
Brilliant. Well, what about television, documentaries, or films?
I recently I watched a documentary about Seymour Hersh. He's the reporter who broke the massacre at My Lai and so many other things. He is, he's sort of been a thorn in the side of practically every American administration going back to Lyndon Johnson, or I guess every American administration going back to Lyndon Johnson. And it's such a great depiction of someone who is pissed off by what he sees happening around him and keeps digging into it. But also, it shows you what we're losing. All of these local newspapers are going under. And I can tell you, as someone who used to write for a local paper, a perfect example, there was a chemical company that spilled into a creek. And so local people had me come out. And so I went and I wrote a story about it. And the chemical company was not happy because they knew that I would write this story, and then the larger Atlanta paper would read this story and they would do something on it. And then the TV news would see this article and they would do things on it. And the whole community would know what happened. The whole city of Atlanta would know what would happen. And they would face backlash. The politicians would have no choice because people were angry that they would have to do something. All of that sort of watchdog protecting you, that is gone. When there's no local paper to let you know that the mayor or the city council or the county commission or a local legislator is ripping you off, they can do it with impunity. And that's what's going to be happening. That's probably what is happening. When I was researching American Sirens, I relied heavily on Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. That newspaper closes operations permanently this May. that will be gone. That record of modern history will disappear. And, there's a ton of mistrust in the media. I think a lot of it misplaced, but, that is who lets you know that your mayor is ripping you off, and if you think, we all know politicians are dirty. The only thing that has ever kept them in check is the fear of being outed. There's nothing to out them now. So nothing will keep them in check. To me, that is a very concerning development for the future. So the documentary about Seymour Hersh was both like incredibly enlightening, but also made me a little nervous, because who's going to be out there watching out for the rest of us going forward? I don't know.
I interviewed a reporter, Larry Doyle, who was a journalist back in the heyday. So, for example, the level of trust that he had, he was the first person to interview Nelson Mandela when he was released from Robben Island. Mm-hmm. So that pretty much speaks for itself. And I was asking him, what happened? What happened? How is it now that what used to be called news is left and right, which that shouldn't even be applied to a news station, but it is. Mm-hmm. The screen's divided into four, and four assholes are arguing with each other, giving their opinions, and there's nothing to do with news, and it's all either obviously paid by the left or paid by the right. And he was saying that TV used to be, or news used to be, under an umbrella of a bunch of other corporations, and so the other businesses would make the money, and the news just told the news, and they had big budgets to travel and do these big exposés. And he said it was kind of like the Murdoch generation, and they turned around one day and said, well, the news needs to make money. And that's when you got the clickbait stories. And if there's one thing we could do in this country with just to insert the concept to everyone's mind, the only fucking thing that people care about, and CNN or Fox, is that the advertising space in the middle. That is it. That is their only actual focus, is to sell ads between Wanky Story 1 and Wanky Story 2. If they could see that, then we would dismantle that part of media and then bolster, like you're talking about, the local media and, arguably the middle of the road, like the BBC used to be, at least, like those kind of, outlets, so that we can have impartial reporting on, hey, this guy was on an island, or this guy, did whatever. And so we can hold these people accountable and make sure that we don't have the wrong kind of human in a horrendous position of power. But as long as we have this model where the angrier the viewer is, the more glued to the TV they are, therefore they're going to watch the fucking drug commercial. This is it. It's completely broken. And then now, as you see, people that subscribe to one or the other politically are slowly then dismantling, whether it's books in schools or news stations or PBS or the Kennedy Center, and they're just taking all these cultural pieces apart, removing plaques with the history of America. It's so obvious, but people are so bought into whatever trench of their World War I warfare mentality that they can't see the game as a whole. And again, like we said, they can't see the bird. All they can see is the one wing. And we're not getting news. And this is why there's distrust. There's not distrust from real journalism. There's distrust because it is, untrustworthy, because the only thing they're trying to do is get you to watch commercials. That is it. Yeah.
No, it's a real problem. And I don't know how you fix it, but we're heading to, like, good things don't come from this, there used to be a phrase, I'm trying to think of, I'm drawing a blank on it, but, was it democracy dies in the dark? When all these news outlets go under, that's the darkness, that is allowing your government, whether it's local or national, to do whatever it wants. And it's always going to act in its own self-interest and not yours. And if there's any doubt in that, you can look at, there's so many examples from history of times when an industry was totally unregulated, or they were, we talked about the insurance industry. The government's quite happy to keep doing what it's doing because it makes a ton of money from insurance. The prison industry their lobbyists kick a ton of money into government. And so, we pay ridiculous amounts of money to have nonviolent offenders in jail for a very long period of time, and it's crazy expensive to put somebody in jail. It's all the stuff that we do, and you kind of look at it and you go, they're enriching themselves, and they have been for a very long time, and you're just sitting back, and the only thing we ever had was the ability to out them, and we're losing that. So I fear for what that's going to look like in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the precursor of a lot of bad things, and I know people always point to the Holocaust, but it's a very good example. It's painting the enemy. It's removing communication. It's polarizing a nation. I mean, it's all the things that we see, and it's not just left. Just not just right. It's right, left. It's the same exact game. And you give an example. Look at Purdue Pharma, that to this day are responsible for 100,000 American deaths through the opioid crisis. That was an FDA-approved drug. That person who approved it then went and worked for Purdue Pharma, and Purdue Pharma to this day still give millions and millions of dollars to politicians on the left and the right. None of that is serving the American people.
No, and that book about the Sackler family and just how it all happened. And there have been a million TV shows, a million documentaries, a million books about the opioid crisis. But yeah, that's a perfect example of everybody knew that what was happening was wrong and that it was going to be a problem. But people were making a ton of money and they were okay with it. There was a time when we all said, there's no way the U.S. government was involved in importing cocaine into the United States. But we all can look back now and go, actually, no, we really were. And, it was all part of Iran-Contra and all these bananas things that were going on. But, we were paying for arms to do this, and we're, supporting this government. We're not supporting that government. We're trying to get these guys overthrown. We're trying to get these guys to grow. And part of the way we're doing it is through drug money. And yes, eventually, we sort of cut Noriega off at the knees, but not until after the crack epidemic had been a thing. Your government is not necessarily your friend. It is an incredibly powerful, it's that bully, maybe you like him because he's sort of charming, but you're also a little bit scared of him because, at some point he's going to turn that negative attention on me, and you never know when it's going to be, and you never know when you're going to get punched by this guy. That's how the government feels, and they need to be held accountable, and all too often they just aren't.
I think what gets me is there are examples of great leaders around the world, and I think a lot of people at the moment, especially, look at Scandinavia. I mean, they have very low violence, they have very low recidivism, very low deaths on the road, very healthy population. Is it perfect? No. I mean, there are gangs in Sweden. There's kind of coming up at the moment. I don't even know what the backstory of that is. There was that horrendous shooting in Norway on the summer camp. So there's always still those things. But overall, they're doing things really well. So what are they doing right that we're not doing here? So this is one of the things about the show is I get the people from these nations and these systems that are working well. And then the question is, well, let the rising tide lifts all ships. We have an opioid crisis. Portugal reversed theirs through decriminalization and bolstering mental health and addiction and job creation and housing. Why are we not copying Portugal's addiction model, Norway's prisons, Finland's education system, Japan's philosophy on food and obesity? It's already figured out. We just you have to have the humility to say, well, let's do that. But as we alluded to, if there are organizations that are lining politicians' pockets that are making billions of dollars from American disease and death, then until the country says enough is enough, we're just going to keep rolling over and accepting it.
Yeah. Somehow we've allowed them to trick us into thinking that a universal healthcare system is going to turn us into the USSR. How we've said, how this thing of it's communism and socialism. Okay, well, I don't know about that, but I know Canadians aren't horrible people and they have a better system than we do. And the English, their system seems to work. It doesn't bankrupt people. Is it perfect? No, but what we have is currently not perfect. Not only is it imperfect, but it can bankrupt people. Our infant mortality rate is not good. There are a lot of developed nations that beat us there. Maybe there's something we can learn. But the people who make those laws, by the way, the same people who are allowed to vote on their own raises every year, the people who make those laws are getting a ton of money from insurance companies. And so how do you convince people that you getting all this money to vote against their best interest is actually in their best interest? Well, you generate a boogeyman and you say, well, it's communism. Well, guess what? There's this thing called Medicare. We already provide healthcare to Americans in need. If you have kidney failure, you know what we do? We pay for your dialysis. Wouldn't have been a whole lot cheaper if we were paying for your lisinopril? Because I can tell you now, dialysis is expensive, and kidney failure leads to heart failure. And we have to pay for all of that. We pay for, and all of your ICU care stays. We pay for. Would have been so much cheaper to pay for your lisinopril, but we didn't, because that would have been communism. But now we will pay for your dialysis, and we will pay for your heart failure, and we will pay for your transplant, and we'll pay for your multiple hospital stays. We'll pay for all of your other medications because we didn't want to pay for your lisinopril, because somebody convinced us that that was the only way to do it. Even though it's not the only way to do it, it's just the only way to keep that company very wealthy. It's a frustrating place to find yourself in, but that's where we are.
Well, coming from the UK, I was born in the 70s, so I got to see it before it started being picked apart, and the pressure of privatization coming from the States. But when you have a national healthcare system, because the socialized medicine is used deliberately to sound like socialism, to sound like you're talking about, that there's nurses goose stepping up and down the ER. Mm-hmm. But, if you have a tax-based healthcare system, then what does that do? It drives you to make your nation as healthy as possible so that you use healthcare as little as possible. It's just basic economics, supply and demand. When you have a profit-based healthcare system like America, what does it do? The opposite is also true. It drives you to keep Americans fat and sick so that you have an addict for life. And, with the lisinopril, example, one step even better is that the person never gets obese or hypertensive or, whatever the disease process is in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so they don't need it. They need help with, with childbirth. They need help with maybe palliative care at the end of their life. They get hit by a bus. But the chronic disease is so much lower when you, like Scandinavia, when you just have things in place to make people healthier in general, clean food and, exercise. And Finland, they, in the Finnish schools, they look at the child holistically, the whole child. They have lots of recess. They bolster schools in areas where, they're financially struggling rather than penalizing them like they do here in America. So, when you invest in your profession the same way as I harp on with the work week in the fire service, when you invest in a fourth shift and you have healthy firefighters with ample rest and recovery, it saves money hand over fist downstream. But someone told me, Patrick Pianza, I think it was, the writer of Code 3, who also was a big fan of national health. He said, I think it was him, maybe it was someone else. Anyway, 20% of our GDP is in healthcare. So when people are like, oh, we don't have the money for it, you do. It's just being pissed away through killing Americans. That's basically it. So you front load that immense amount of money. Imagine what you could do, not only in the health of your nation, but in education and security and bolstering the first responders and, all these other things. But the problem is it's all leaving our pockets and going into these predatory businesses. And it's not at the benefit of us whatsoever.
Not one bit. I was in Mexico when my EpiPen broke. I'm allergic to bees. So I walk into a Mexican pharmacy. If you've ever bought an EpiPen, they're like $500. Maybe, I think there's a coupon. You might be able to get one for $350. I once had a doctor try to charge me $700 for one. I walked into a pharmacy in Mexico, asked for Epi. He gave me, the guy behind the counter gave me a styrofoam cube with 30 ampules of epinephrine in it for $30. Enough to save me from a million bee stings. So
is that your next book?
Yeah. Why am I paying $500 for Epi here and, $30 for 30 ampules in Mexico? What's wrong with that system? And you can, we, as someone who grew up and has really only lived in a capitalist society, I'm quite happy in the U.S. I like the things we have. I like how we incentivize hard work and all these other things. I'm a believer in the system. I'm also a believer in that any system can be abused, and that there are a lot of people out there who aren't looking out for everybody else, or only looking out for themselves. And there are instances where that really shows. That I think the healthcare industry is one of them. The fact that an EpiPen is $500 here, and then in El Paso, your EpiPen would be $500. Walk across the border, and you're getting 30 ampules for $30. That says something, and it should be eye opening, and it should make people really friggin' angry. But it doesn't seem to. And I think it's because we're so hidden behind our own walls that we just can't. Like it's really hard to break through. And I think they've done that to us. They've sort of spun us in circles and made us very defensive, and everybody sort of crawled back to their corners. But we put ourselves in the corner. We allowed ourselves to be backed into a corner. There isn't any threat that's put us in this corner. We've backed into these corners, and so we feel like, well, this is it. I'm as far back as I can go, and so I've got to fight anything that comes to me. But somebody clicked on the lights. You just see 4 people standing in a corner and nothing else. 4 people ready to fight to the death with no enemy in front of them. And I think we'd all be a little bit embarrassed if they did that. But that's where we are. Hopefully, we can begin to make some change. I'm gonna go with your hope, man. I'm gonna go with your hope.
Let's go grab a light bulb.
Right.
All right. Well, the next question, is there a person that you'd recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
I'm trying to think of who. Somebody like.
We're going to try and get John Moon on, so that'll be one of them. Hopefully.
John Moon would be great. John Moon would be fantastic. I would say that I know a lot of people who volunteer in other countries and in the U.S., and they go all around, medical volunteers. And I'm always intrigued by their perspective of seeing, people in distress from all different cultures, the unifying nature of this stuff, but also, the ways in which different people are handling things. And I always think they have such a great perspective. So, a friend of mine, Ryan Kerr, former paramedic, current ICU nurse, he's always in some other war zone or disaster zone. And I think that sort of perspective of, what we all collectively face, and the ways in which we can do it better, I think is always helpful.
Brilliant. Absolutely. All right. Well, the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you. What do you do to decompress? I swim a lot. I find myself swimming more and more. Maybe it's working less. There's something about, endurance exercise, that first 5 minutes where you're like, today's not the day, I can't do it today, I'm going to have to quit. And you push through it. And then you get to that 10-minute mark where you just some other gear kicks in and you're like, oh, I can do this for the next 3 hours. And your mind just really empties out. And by the time I get out of the pool, I'm rubbery with exhaustion. It's such a great stress reliever. And it just empties your mind in the same way that standing in the shower empties your mind. And suddenly all these clear thoughts come in, and there is no, there's no phone stimulation. There's no computer stimulation. All those things are literally impossible. I mean, that's the thing about a run. You can still have your phone and be doing, but in a pool, that those don't exist. And so to me, that is to just totally be alone with my own thoughts. It's even sensory deprivation. You can't hear. It's a perfect exercise. I know now you can have the headphones that go in the pool, and I think I've even seen goggles that have I don't know exactly what they're displaying, but they're displaying something, whether it's the time of your workout. But yeah, exactly.
At some point, isn't there something more important than data? Like, is that really all you are, is a data point? I don't know.
Yeah, I agree completely.
There's
I think
10,000 years of
intuition.
evolution packed into your brain. Like, let that breathe a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was talking just to my wife yesterday. I think it was her. You know, I eat differently every day depending on what my body seems to want. There's days where I'm just jonesing for red meat. There's other days where, a little bit of toast and I'm good for 8 hours. It's bizarre. But, if you just constantly, again, locked into an app or whatever, absolutely helps some people, great tool. But I think if you're too focused in an external device telling you what you should be doing, you're not listening to the greatest computer on the planet, which is your own body.
Yeah. No, I agree.
All right. Well, just reiterate then where people can find the book or the books, plural, excuse me. And then if they want to reach out to you, learn about you, where are the other places online?
So the books are anywhere. 1,000 Naked Strangers, American Sirens, you can have them today. They're audio, they're ebook, and then they're also, hard copy, paperback, in any bookstore, any place that you get books. No One's Coming is available for pre-order. There is an audio book if you're into those things. I know a lot of people love those. I can't personally listen to a book. I've got to hold a book. But it is pre-orderable now in all its forms from anywhere that you want to get it. And then, I'm around. I'm on, I try to, pass along information, what's going on with me. And, I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and look for my name and you'll find me there. And I'm always happy to engage.
Did you narrate any of your audiobooks?
No, I haven't. And, which I'm fine with. But at the same time, sometimes I listen to one and I'm like, oh, this seems overly dramatic. Then the door opened and you're like, oh, but I think that's what people want. I don't know. They want a certain experience. So I'm happy to give it to them.
Yeah. I challenge you to read one yourself one day, one of your books, because I found that the first one I just read because I was completely broke, and, they were literally, biography stories, my stories. And then it went to a takeaway, it was obesity or mental health, whatever it was. The second one was a fiction. I'm like, okay, well, now I'm going to have to pay an actor because I couldn't possibly do this. But then you're looking at it, you're like, kind of to your point, how is anyone really going to know what this looks like? Because I can see it, I can smell it, I can taste it, I can hear the screams, etc. Are they really going to be able to relay, what this is really about? And so super uncomfortable. I had to do different kind of voice intonations and accents and things. But, the takeaway was, what is more important, having a air quotes polished professional voice actor doing it, or being engaged with the person who actually wrote it. So it'd be interesting if, maybe not this book, but the next one, if you end up narrating that, what you think as far as the outcome. Because even my own family said that they stopped hearing my voice after a few minutes and they just got pulled into the story. And if my own family had that, then I guess, our imposter syndrome of, which was living rent free in my head, that, I'm going to sound like a twat when I'm reading this. This is your story. So, one would also argue, well, there's no better person on the planet to read your book than the person who wrote it.
Mm. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. It's a lot of time with myself.
Yeah, and it's weird as well, because writing I found cathartic, but reading it, especially with emotion, when you're not doing a play, but you're bringing these pages to life, it almost had the reverse effect, where you're actually, it's so visceral as you're trying to kind of relay this story vocally, that it almost brought some of the trauma back, and not in a bad way, but you didn't finish and go, okay, I feel a little better. You're like, oh, actually, I feel a bit worse now. Let me go do something that will make me feel better. Let me go for a swim. So that was kind of interesting to see as well, that writing, everything flowed out, but reading and reading and almost reliving these scenes in the storytelling way almost had the reverse effect. It was draining.
Yeah,
I'm not really selling it to you, though.
That's how I envision it being. So you're confirming my bias.
All right. Well, Kevin, I want to thank you so much. I mean, the last conversation was phenomenal. Obviously, we took a lot deeper dive into the last two books, but this was really fascinating to revisiting some of those topics and then also learning from scratch, the latest book and what these incredible people did during Ebola. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming back onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Yeah, man. Thanks. Great to be here every time.